This week, I want to look at Echoing Hope, How the Humanity of Jesus Redeems Our Pain by Kurt Willems. And Kurt is a friend of mine, so I'm going to be biased in this one, but that's okay because I do want to talk about this book. And also, this is my first book review, so I thought I would do a book by a friend, and that way it will probably go easier. So that's what I'm doing. So Echoing Hope, How the Humanity of Jesus Redeems Our Pain. Before talking about the book, I want to talk just briefly about the humanity of Jesus, because this is such an important part of theology, and it's a part of theology that kind of gets neglected a lot. And it's just so weird too that you think of, like, humanity has existed in this universe for tens of thousands of years, and for thousands of years we've dreamt about a creator, and we've fantasized about what would it be like to meet the creator, and we get these visions of, like, face melting illumination and angels singing and just this incredible majesty. And then the New Testament comes along and says, good news, the creator has come to visit us. But instead of this face melting illuminating majesty, God came as just some guy in the first century. It's such a weird belief, and but I think it means a lot, and I still think we are unpacking the depth of that profundity. Our eyes are still adjusting to the light that God actually illuminated us with. In Confident Humility, I base my entire hypothesis of confident humility on the humanity of Jesus. I really talk largely about what does the humanity of Jesus mean for how we understand ourselves and how we understand humility and how we understand confidence. Kurt takes the humanity of Jesus and asks the question, how does the humanity of Jesus illuminate our trauma and our pain and our suffering? And so we both recognize that central reality, the central power and the profundity of God becoming human. And Kurt has so much, and it's the shame of these book reviews is that I'm going to have to just bulldoze over so much complexity and nuance, and Kurt definitely has a lot of that here. I just want to highlight a couple key sort of themes that Kurt touches on that I think is just so important. What's the first one? The first theme that he really touches on that's so important is that God suffers with us. And I just think that Kurt does a masterful job of just nailing the centrality of that insight, that God suffers with us, not as an architect who meticulously plans all of our suffering for some greater good, but rather as a God whose heart breaks when our heart breaks. And from a trauma perspective and from a healing perspective, I just think that makes all the difference in the world. I think that it's really hard to heal from your trauma if you assume that God willed your trauma to happen, if God wanted your suffering to happen. Because the fact is that if God wills it, well, then that suffering was personal. That suffering was intentional. God wanted that to happen. And so if that's the case, if that suffering is personal, and if that suffering was meant to be, well, it's really hard to process that suffering, to process that trauma, and to move past it, because we will forever be stuck in a loop of lamenting where we keep asking, why did this happen? And there is no why. If there is no why, then you'll be stuck there and you'll never be able to heal past it. It's only when you realize that evil and suffering are not part of God's will that you can now see the evil and the suffering as the arbitrary injustice, as the evil that it is, and you can accept it as something that is absolutely ungodly, and you can see it as something that breaks God's heart instead of fulfills God's wishes. And it's then that you can move past it and you can let go of it, because God had no secret meaning to it. God had no secret greater good there for you. He might pull goods out of it, but that's just something that God does to help us with our healing and to help redeem our pain. The second kind of insight in here that is so important is that well, what is the second one? Oh, the second one is this: that empathy is a greater divine attribute than control, and that is so profound. And he talks a lot about open theism and atonement models and all that kind of stuff, but it all revolves around this idea that empathy really is more powerful. Control tends to separate. Control tends to, and this is all my thinking, this isn't what Kurt says, but control tends to have one person dominant, and everybody else sort of becomes puppets. But empathy tends to unite, and empathy tends to identify with other people. And so what we find in God is a God who is omni-empathetic. And again, this is my terminology, not Kurt's. But I just think that's just so profound. And the cool thing about that is that in the same way that God models this empathy toward us and becoming one of us fully, Hebrews says, just like anybody else who experiences the same temptations and the same suffering as other people, God took on all of that so that he could empathize with us perfectly. In the same way, we are called to be vulnerable so that we can be empathetic, so that we can be in touch with suffering. And that takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable. And I got to say, Kurt, in this book, man, he really talks about some really hard things in his own life, about some of the suffering that he took on from his stepfather, and says some really hard things. And Kurt does a really good job of modeling that vulnerability and what healing might look like through that type of vulnerability, and how you can work through those types of traumatic experiences with Jesus and Jesus's humanity as sort of your guide through that. Overall, I think it's a really good book. If you've experienced trauma or suffering, I think this is a really, really helpful companion for you. I think of it must have been 5 years where I was experiencing pretty profound grief after Jessica died. This would have saved me a ton of time processing my grief, and it would have helped my own healing in great, great ways. He does jump around to a lot of different stuff, but I think the reason for that is because when we experience profound suffering or trauma, it affects so many secret nooks and crannies and nodes throughout our psyche. It's hard to even know the full impact of what trauma or grief or whatever, what the impact of that is. And this is why, you can feel like you've gotten over something, and then you could be watching like a TV commercial and all of a sudden you start bawling. And there's just all of these little hidden secret things that pain causes. And so I think like the spider kind of web of all of the related issues around suffering and theology, I think serves a good purpose. It helps us to touch as many of those potentially hidden nodes of suffering as possible as we work through our own grief. And really, a book like this, I think the biggest value that it provides is I think it gives us a justification to be comforted by God. You don't have to believe that God wanted this suffering to happen, but God is just grieving with us. And I think that can provide great comfort and justified comfort. But it also gives us justified hope that God will redeem that suffering and that evil in our lives. And finally, I think a book like this helps us when we've experienced something traumatic or deep grief. It gives us justification to keep on keeping on, to keep on caring, to keep on pursuing Christ-likeness, to keep on seeking God. And I think that is invaluable.